beyond jazzed for this episode 31 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. We have just in my books an absolute legend, Carmen Joy Imes, and you'll hear. I don't really feel the need to do a lot of preamble or setup because it is abundantly clear as you go in the opening moments of this conversation why you're going to want to listen to this one. It's really good. It's going to be both intriguing and provocative. Oh, you're going to love it. So make sure that if you do love it, you spread the word. You share it with somebody that you think would also enjoy it. You can do that in all kinds of ways. You can leave ratings and reviews, or you can just literally like write letters to people and be like, sometime in the distant future when you receive this note, go to the internet and find this thing. There's lots of things you can do, but definitely go ahead and share it and let us know how you're accessing it because we'd love to hear from you. But in this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about all kinds of things, but basically it all centers around the idea that you and I are made either in the image or as the image of God. So let's find out how an expert can actually tell us what that might mean. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the esteemed pleasure, the unparalleled pleasure of having with us today Dr. Carmen Joy Imes. Now, is Joy your middle name? Do you hyphenate? Because I see Joy some places, but not all places.
It's my middle name, and I use it when I'm writing, and it doesn't always make it in depending on who is putting the text out there.
Right. Well, I mean, my nickname, my last name is Jolicoeur, and so because people are not universally French, a nickname that's kind of gotten shortened around is Jolly. And so this podcast is called the Jolly Thoughts podcast. So Joy, I feel like it's pretty on point. So
it's right on point. We'll
roll with it here. Yeah, that's great. And so we actually spoke, goodness, would have been a couple of years ago now, on a different podcast with our friend Jeremy, who is a great podcaster and sends a lot of information out to youth workers across Canada and across the US. And that was about your first, I want to say your first published book, or at the very least your first major published book, Bearing God's Image, right?
Bearing God's Name.
Bearing God's Name. You can, and in just a moment, you'll see why I made that Freudian slip, because we were talking right before this that just today, within a few hours, you have clicked send on your manuscript going off to the publisher for edits and other glorifications for your follow-up, in a sense, I guess you could say, to that, which is called
Being God's Image.
Being God's Image, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So I have set myself up for a lot of people mixing those up because they sound really similar. But bearing God's name and being God's image are related, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Right. And I personally, I was in school at the time when that book came out. And so I got so much traction out of that one little, honestly, relatively little in terms of how a lot of these academic books are, with just that concept of the name and all that kind of thing. So it was an absolute goldmine for me. So I absolutely appreciated your work on this, and I'm really excited to be able to get my hands on this one when it comes out at some point in time. But today, what kind of precipitated this conversation was you did I don't know if you call it a colloquium, or it was some sort of a conference.
Yeah, it was a lecture at a conference. There were 6 or so of us presenting at a conference on the image of God. So the conference was called Exploring Personhood. And we were all talking about different aspects of the Imago Dei.
Right. Which, of course, is on point with the research that you have been doing for this upcoming book.
Yeah, this is how I got the invitation. Someone caught wind that I was working on a book on the image of God. So they invited me, not realizing that I really am not an expert on this issue. I'm writing the book to learn things. So I said yes to the invitation to speak because I felt like it would hold me accountable to keep making progress on the book and get to the point where I'd have something to say. And it did that. It helped me finish on time, and it helped me learn so much and really strengthen the ideas that I had.
Yeah. It was a really powerful presentation. I really appreciated it. So we'll make sure to link to that. It's available online on YouTube.
Yep.
And we'll link to your write-up, which you did a kind of a blog post about your appearance, if you will, at at this conference. And the reason that it's notable, maybe you would want to give us a Cole's Notes version of why you had to wrestle even a little bit in advance of accepting it, not just because of your maybe lack of preparedness on the content.
Yes, sure. So the conference was held at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I am not a Southern Baptist, and I am, last time I checked, a woman, and women don't typically teach Bible in Southern Baptist context, at least not to men. And so I was surprised when I got the invitation, because I don't think that I could hold the post that I have. I teach Old Testament at Biola University in Southern California. I don't think they would let me do that at Southeastern, but they were inviting me to speak at this conference. And so I was surprised. And then I wondered, are they going to eat me for lunch? And then I wondered, if they don't, what is my responsibility as an outsider to the Southern Baptist Convention? What is my responsibility in terms of coming in, speaking in a context in which there are problems? We're recording this the week after the Southern Baptist Convention released the results of the independent investigation of clergy abuse. And so the whole world is talking about the SBC now. And when I got the invitation to speak at the conference last August, it was just on the heels of the convention voting to decide to submit to independent investigation. And it was clear then, as it's been for a while, that all is not well in the SBC in terms of treatment of women, especially. And there have been a lot of issues on treatment of people of color that have been problematic. And so I kind of felt like, if I'm going to accept money to be on stage in an SBC context, what is my responsibility? And decided I didn't feel comfortable speaking on the image of God in a context in which people were experiencing patterns of abuse or mistreatment without talking about those things. So I said yes to speaking, and then prayed a whole lot about how would I come into a context in which I'm an outsider and say hard things? Like, what gives me the authority to do that? How could I do it in a way that would be heard? It was quite an experience. I was very, very warmly received, to my surprise. They even gave me a standing ovation at the end of my talk. Not everyone, but there was a contingent who did. And just a lot of gratitude expressed from people who were there. Thank you for saying hard things. Thank you for doing it gently and lovingly. And I'm just really grateful that they were able to receive it the way I intended it for it to be given. So in the blog post that you mentioned, I have a picture of myself in front of Patterson Hall, named after the infamous Paige Patterson, who was removed from the presidency of Southwestern because of his failure to report abuse and his trying to get victims of abuse not to report it. And so there I was, standing in front of this building that's still named after him, wondering, why haven't they changed the name of this building in light of all the attention that the SBC is getting about abuse? And just this week, President Danny Aiken of Southeastern announced that he's going to send a firm recommendation to the board that they change the name of the building. So there is actually some really good stuff happening at Southeastern in response to all of this public attention on the issue of abuse.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been quite a ride.
That is wild. That is wild. And I don't know exactly when this will go out, but probably in a few weeks or so. So as you mentioned, This is May 31st when we're recording right now. So yes, there is all of that. So that's obviously a whole lot of baggage. But if you could foresee, and neither you nor I are experts in the Southern Baptist Convention. We see the news, we know people who are in there, but we're not. So I won't ask you to speak directly to the kinds of things that are currently even going on in there. But if you could remove all of that kind of like really heavy baggage, there would even be a glaring challenge, like you kind of mentioned in the beginning, like you yourself, at least in the overwhelming majority of these churches, would not be able to get up on a Sunday morning, for example,
Right.
and preach a message. You likely
Right.
wouldn't be able to hold the kind of role at that school that you
Right.
spoke at that you would be able to. And so I was sitting there and watching it. I'm trying to understand what sort of philosophical gymnastics people have to do to be able to kind of isolate these really specific areas, I guess. We can come back to that a little bit if you want to, but the reason it's important, I maybe it stood out so much, is because you got up there and spoke about the image of God, and then spoke about it in a way that made it very explicit that it was not masculine, by at least not exclusively masculine. And so do you want to kind of, I mean, you said a lot, but if you were like, here's a couple of like the key points about that, what would you kind of unpack or give us a brief here so that we can kind of, as a jumping off point?
Sure. I will just say that I think the reason why they were able to have women participate in this conference, they do have females on faculty. Karen Swallow Pryor is a very prominent evangelical leader who teaches at Southeastern.
The notorious KSP, if you're looking for her.
Yes. She's a lot of fun to follow on Twitter. She does not shy away from conflict. And I asked her ahead of time about what would I be getting into if I came. And she said, I just love Southeastern because it's a place where we can have hard conversations. So I thought that it would work well. But in terms of teaching Bible or theology in that context, this was a conference in which there was a clear sort of disclaimer. You'll see a disclaimer on the YouTube channel and on the website that the views expressed are not necessarily the views of Southeastern. And so they could have me come in and do a one-off thing in a way that they couldn't have me do permanently on their faculty. So
I think we need to get one of those disclaimers for our guest preachers at our church. I wonder, is that a boilerplate thing we can just download somewhere? The views expressed, yeah,
probably
good for worship leaders too.
Interestingly, they had a respondent from Southeastern, John Hammett, who's a theologian, and he responded to all of our talks at the end. He spent most of his response time talking about my presentation. And he did have pushback in a few minor areas, but not in the areas where I expected to get pushback. So the social issues that I raised, I thought might cause a firestorm of controversy because I wasn't taking the typical conservative Republican Party line on those issues. And that's not where I got pushback. And he thanked me for being a friend to Southeastern. So although there was a disclaimer posted, and it's not like they put me through the rigorous hiring process, they did receive my message with gratitude. And my hope was that it would spark further conversations, deeper conversations on that campus among those who are there for the long haul about maybe changes that need to happen. I was hoping it would give courage to others who are seeing problems and wanting to do something about it. And as you said, I'm not an expert in Southern Baptist polity, although I do pay attention, especially when it's trending on Twitter. So in 2 weeks, the Southern Baptist Convention is meeting 20 minutes from here in Anaheim for their meetings, and it will be very interesting to see whether the messengers vote to take action on the report that was just released. This is just the first step. There's lots of action steps. So anyway, all of that's preamble. You asked me to talk about gender, I think.
Well, about specifically how you brought it out in respects to the image of God.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think as I've been working on this topic of the image of God, I've been really struck by a number of things in Genesis. One is that from the very beginning, when God announces that humanity is made in his image, it's clear from the beginning that it's male and female are made in the image of God, that it's not as though men are the image of God and women are an afterthought or a kind of subspecies or something. Men and women both are the image of God. And I've been working on that language as I told you I hit send on my manuscript today. I've done a lot of thinking about how can we talk about genderality in a way that is going to work in this generation. These are hotly contested topics, and the ground is shifting as we speak. And so to say that male and female are both the image of God is not to leave out someone who is perhaps intersex or even trans. Male and female is a way of saying everyone, every human. Like, I don't think that the author of Genesis was thinking in terms of a spectrum on gender or a spectrum on sexuality. I don't think that Genesis 1 and 2 can bear the weight of all of our modern questions about gender and sexuality, but I think it does say loud and clear that no one's excluded, no person is excluded from being God's image.
I mean, one of the questions that I don't think get answered there is, if every person is in the image of God, what makes a person a person?
Yes.
And so, like, because there is this sort of a chicken or the egg kind of a thing happening. So it's like, if God creates you as his image, is that the very thing then that gives you personhood, or is your personhood in some respects what is enabling you to then bear the image? I think a lot of questions obviously around what is a person, obviously have other kind of political and also, moral and real-time consequences in our world. So
something that I didn't write about but probably should have, I just don't feel qualified, is technology and the image of God. With artificial intelligence and robots and potential for cloning and some combinations of these things, this is part of what drives the question, how do we define a person? At what point is someone a person, and at what point are they no longer a person? Right. So there were others at the conference who spoke more directly to that question: what makes a human being different from animals? At what point do we cross the line and not have a person? I would say just a really basic, non-specialist definition of being a person is somebody who was born from a human mother. like we're human because we're born, and we cannot gain or lose personhood by having specific capacities or talents or abilities. And so that was one of the main things I wanted to bring out in my talk. So my talk was kind of two-part. The first half was sort of recapping what some prominent evangelical theologians and biblical scholars are saying about the image of God, like what's the state of research on this question, and then working out the implications for practice and social policy and treatment of each other and all of that. But one thing that I have become very convinced is that you cannot lose the image of God. So I do not believe that in Genesis 3, the image was lost or destroyed or even diminished in any way. Every human being is still the image of God. After Genesis chapter 3, we see that in chapter 5 with the genealogy of Adam. It says, chapter 5, verse 3 says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. And that's following up on the statement in verse 1, when God created mankind, he made them the likeness of God. So this, the genealogy after the fall kind of picks up on that language of, remember, God made people as his image. And then Adam had a son in his image, which tells us how to think about image. Being the image of God implies kinship. We are related to God. We're part of the royal family. And apparently that's still true even after the fall. And then in I think even clearer is in Genesis 9, after the flood, God tells Noah, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind. So even after the flood, we're down to just Noah and his family are left. The idea is that the reason we have to treat other people with dignity is because they're made in God's image. We can't treat human life lightly.
Yeah, that's pretty rock solid. I mean, that post-flood one, because
Mhm.
things had gotten pretty bad. And so one of the things that you kind of hear is that, it's marred beyond recognition in some respects.
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
needs, in our evangelical circles, maybe a second birth or second life for that image to kind of be restored in some respects. But to know that even kind of at rock bottom, if you will, the image is still there. And that's one of the other things you teased out, I think, very well, even though rather briefly, was the idea that it's not faculty based or like attribute based.
Yes.
That's kind of how I've been used to hearing about the image of God, and frankly, how I've spoken about it.
I probably have too.
That we are the rational animal in some respects. That rationality is in some ways, or we're creative. All these things are not necessarily untrue. They just may not be the causal kind of link that we were talking about earlier, right?
Yes. So there is a difference between humans and animals. And we'd all agree that there's a difference, a qualitative difference between humans and animals. But that difference is not we can't limit our human personhood or our status as the image of God to whatever that difference is.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah. The other thing that blew me away was getting towards kind of like gender relations and how they work together, which is not the only thing we'll talk about, but hey, we'll talk about it. Was if you said something about the idea that we kind of like live in a Genesis 3 world, even though we could understand our relationships from a Genesis 1 and 2 world. Do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And again, I was speaking in an SBC context where there's a very clear hierarchy between men and women and very clear boundaries on what women can and can't do in the church. And what I've heard repeatedly, because although I'm not SBC, I'm SBC adjacent, and I've been in contexts my entire life. I think what I keep hearing is people seeing hierarchy in creation and grounding their vision of how the sexes relate to one another in chapter 3. Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. That becomes the kind of locus of how we think about gender relations, but that's the consequence of human sin. It's not the vision of what God had in mind. And so I spend quite a bit of time in my book on chapters 1 and 2 and showing how the fact that both male and female are made in God's image or made as God's image, and that this implies that they rule over, or the implication of it is that they rule over creation, and that rulership is not given just to Adam, it's given to both of them. That this implies a need to think about gender relations as a partnership, that we partner together in fulfilling God's purpose for humanity in the world. And so I talk about some of the sticking points in chapter 2, especially where people have looked and seen hierarchy. And I don't think hierarchy is an appropriate way of construing the passage. So maybe the most interesting one for your listeners would be in chapter 2, verse 18. The Lord said, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." And that word helper is unfortunate, because in English, a helper is subservient. We usually think of a helper as someone who, is a sidekick or someone who cleans up after the main act. But that's not what this Hebrew word means. The word ezer in Hebrew occurs like 100 times, almost 100 times in the Old Testament. And half of those times it refers to Yahweh as Israel's helper, clearly not a subservient role. The other half is in military context, referring to someone who, like another army that comes, or another battalion that comes and aids you in battle so that you can win and overcome your enemy. So this seems really significant to me. There's not a single use of ezer in the Old Testament to describe what a servant does.
And if you remember, what's that hymn? Here I raise my Ebenezer.
Yes, yes.
And I think that's a
It's the
biblical,
same
that's the
word.
word, Ebenezer or
Evan is
whatever.
rock,
Right.
and then Ezer. Ebenezer is my rock of help.
Right.
Um,
So God
yeah.
is not your servant. He's not the one who comes along and cleans up
No,
afterwards. He's the one that
no.
comes alongside and
He
helps.
empowers.
Right.
He's like a military ally when we're up against an enemy and we can't win on our own. He comes and fights side by side with us and helps us win. So this is what Adam needs in the garden. His job is to rule the earth, to subdue it, which is a pretty strong word. Kavash is it's a heavy-handed word.
Mm-hmm.
If there's going to be a rebellion, or if there's going to be some problem in the garden, it's Adam's job to quell that and to put it down. And he needs help. He needs an ally. And so God makes a woman to be that ally. And I think if we rooted our thinking of in gender relations to that sense of partnership, allyship between men and women, we'd be in a very different place thinking about ministry.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, the idea of kind of a description versus prescription kind of stands out here a lot, right? Just because the Bible might, in some respects, tell you how things are, does not necessarily always tell you that's how they should be.
How it should be, right?
I thought it was interesting that you pointed out too, and this might just be a setup so you can help us with the words, because your facility with Hebrew is delightful. So the idea that it's not necessarily that it's husband and wife. In those opening passages, it's man and woman. So
yeah,
it's man and woman that are created in the image of God, not necessarily
male,
husband and wife.
male and female. Specifically, and the words used there are the anatomical words, like the biologically male and the biologically female.
Right.
There's really nothing in Genesis 1 and 2 about gender roles, and not everyone is maybe comfortable or familiar with separating between sex and gender. But if that's new to you, it's something you're going to have to get used to, because this is the way the world is going. There's biological sex that talks about our anatomy, what body parts were we born with? And then there's gender, which is how that's expressed in our culture, how our gender identity is expressed, which is culturally specific. Mm-hmm. So in the United States, pink is a color that girls wear. When we lived in the Philippines, men often wore pink. And there was a very masculine mayor whose color was pink. And when he built something, he would paint it pink, so everyone would give him credit for building it. So pink was not a feminine thing in the Philippines like it is in the US. So those are gender issues. They're gender differences. And so the words used in Genesis 1:27 are regarding anatomical, biological sex. Male and female.
But also even more than that, so you're separating gender and sex, but also relationship. So and you tell me if I'm going off here, but it's not a married pair.
Yes.
Which we know that image does get ported into the New Testament. So obviously, like, marriage is viewed as a kind of a sacrament that in some respects images, if you will, the relationship between Christ and the church. But if we go back, these opening passages, even though Adam and Eve are, I guess, married, I'm not really sure what the ceremony looked like. That's not necessarily, and I want you to push back if this is correct, it's not their marriage covenant or that's necessarily showing the image of God. It is their fullness of biology, their fullness of gender representations.
I think that's a fair way of putting it. We sort of mush chapters 1 through 3 together to be like one thing, but clearly we have two creation accounts that have different purposes. Like, they're just like if you went on a vacation and you came back and you had conversations with two different people about your vacation, you might tell different things because one of them is an astrophysicist and wants to know about
you have interesting friends. Wow.
Than your neighbor who's a gardener, and so you're going to tell them different things. They're going to have different interests. I just went on a trip yesterday with my husband and my father and my son, and we rode we took a boat trip out to Catalina Island. And my son, who is wired to be an engineer, he's 13, but he's wired that way, was explaining to us about the pivot point on the ship and where the engine is and how, like, where you need to be on the ship for the least turbulence. And then we saw a barge, and he explained to us like how much it can hold before it's, at the wrong, and why it was tipped a little in the water because it was an empty barge. And like, he thinks in terms of mechanics.
Right.
When I told my mom about the trip, I was sending her pictures of flowers, and I did not tell her anything about the pivot point on a barge. So different people get a different story. And so back to Genesis, chapter 1 is giving us one portrait of creation. Chapter 2 is giving us a different portrait of the creative process with different aims. And so the male and female in chapter 1, verse 27 are not Adam and Eve, the first couple. The male and female are talking about all humans. It's talking about humankind in general. And we don't actually get the name Adam and the name Eve until chapter 3. Right. So we have a generic human and then woman in chapter 2. Adam means human. And then there's a woman, and she's not named until chapter 3. And yes, by the end of chapter 2, this man and this woman are married. But I think your point, which is an important point to make, is that you don't have to be married to be the image of God. Right. It's not as though each individual is a half the image of God, and we need to be married to be the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I think it's like we have a we have a slam dunk case for this with Jesus, because the New Testament describes Jesus as the perfect representation of God. He is the image of God, and he's not married.
Right. That's good. Oh man, nailed it. You can't argue with that. Well, you could, but you'd be wasting your breath. Now, one of the things you mentioned too, and this is where the fun with language comes in, is sometimes we're saying as the image, and sometimes we're saying in the image.
Yeah.
Beit Tselem or whatever. So what do you land on a, like, is it happening is it being used differently in different places? Do you have a preference on it? And is there actually, other than like splitting hairs, is there actually a difference between those two interpretations?
Okay, so I would say there's a debate about the best way to translate Genesis 1:27. God created mankind in his own image or as his own image. And as you said, the word image is tselem, which is a concrete thing, like an idol. Like an idol is an image of a god. So humans are an image, a concrete representation of Yahweh. The word image has a preposition attached to it. It's the preposition beit, or be, the letter B. And like as in English, prepositions in Hebrew are flexible depending on the context. And so many people translate this, the majority of people translate this as in his image. God creates mankind in his own image. And some people feel like that is important because it's sort of one step removed from God. It's like distancing to say we're made in God's image, but we aren't God's image, is kind of an important like a disclaimer, like we're not God. Okay. For some people.
Right.
I prefer to translate it as God's own image, and that would take it as a beit of essence. I'll give you another quick example of a beit of essence that I came across today in Exodus chapter 6. God says, Exodus 6 verse 2, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself fully known to them. So God Almighty is El Shaddai. That's how the NIV is translating El Shaddai. So there it's El Shaddai. He didn't appear to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in God Almighty. He appeared as God Almighty. Right. Like God Almighty is how he appeared. And so that it would be the same. I'm reading it as the same kind of construction in Genesis 1:27. God created mankind as his image. That is, humans are the image of God. We're not in the image or sort of like the image. We are the image.
Right.
So that's how I read it. Is it splitting hairs? Maybe. The reason I prefer to translate it that way is because of what we already talked about. I don't see image as a particular capacity or function that can be lost. It's something we are. It's our human identity. And here I'm relying on the work of Ryan Peterson, one of my colleagues here at Biola, who wrote his dissertation on the image of God. And he argues that the Imago Dei is our human identity. It's not a capacity that can be lost. There are others who've argued this as well. John Kilner is one of them. So if we can't lose it, I guess to me, to say that we're made as the image of God makes it harder to separate me from image.
Yeah.
And so since I'm trying to help people see that the image is not something that can be lost or destroyed, I feel like to say we're made as the image of God, or we are the image of God, is a stronger way of saying it. It doesn't leave that wiggle room to suggest that we could be separated from it. So say you're in a car accident and you have a debilitating injury, or maybe you're in a coma and you're not even conscious anymore. Have you lost are you no longer the image of God? I'd say, no, you haven't lost anything. You are still human because you were still born of your mother. God made you his image. If you physically exist, if you have breath, you are the image of God.
Yeah. And you can tell me if I'm part of the problem with any kind of translation is, if you try to diagram it, like one sense can go in one direction, but then now you have this other kind of semantic field that not everything in that field is going to work with everything else.
Right.
So we end up I end up making mistakes. So I'm just going to rephrase it like this, and you tell me if this is right. So if you're made in God's image, and I've literally heard people kind of argue that this is used in some respects to say, well, this is kind of like you look like God. So God so you're in the image is like a related, in the sense that it's kind of like you are similar to God in these ways.
Yeah.
As the image would mean whether or not God has 2 eyes and 10 toes, you are being made to fill this function, which is to image God. Now,
yes.
Tell me.
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Good. I love that.
I'll push back a little bit. And this might be splitting hairs. I've heard there are others who use image as a verb. We are supposed to image God. I think as soon as we say that, it ties it to function. And then in my mind, that's something we can lose by being unable to do whatever that function is. And so I'm refraining from using image as a verb. We are the image of God. It has implications for what we do, but it isn't something we do. Like the content of the image is not a thing we do. Just by existing, we are fulfilling our identity. So that's just a slight different nuance from what you said.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And then I would, that's a good segue into one of the things you said earlier was that we're kind of stuck. It seems like we're living stuck in a Genesis 3 kind of world, for very obvious reasons in some respects. I mean, that is how the narrative flows. We move from Genesis 1 to Genesis 3, and then 4, and then eventually you get to there's dragons and stuff. It's quite a book.
It is.
But so you mentioned the idea that how Christians deal with kind of ecological concerns. So now we're kind of moving away a little bit from gender and just kind of looking at some of the, I mean, you kind of hit on justice issues and you hit on kind of environmental, and you mentioned the work of Sandra Richter, who I haven't had a chance to actually read. What's the primary book of hers?
Well, she has two books now that she's especially known for: Epic of Eden and Stewards of Eden.
Right.
So the work I'm referring to is Stewards of Eden. They're both great books, but Stewards of Eden is where she talks about the human task to care for creation. And she links that, of course, with image of God, because that's how the Bible presents it. Because you're the image, here's what I want you to do: fill the earth and subdue it, rule over it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and basically maintain the order that God has established on earth.
Yeah, which is kind of what, that's a great way of saying it, because you are the image.
Yes.
Represent me well.
Yes. Yeah.
Not as you represent me. But so
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. So, but it's interesting that not all Christians seem to react this way, and yet huge swaths, I always get the word wrong, huge chunks of our kind of cultural Christians end up not really taking the creation care component of that that image representation, if you will, very seriously. And not even just that, not even just like writing it off, but in some respects it comes up as being almost anti-imagistic in the respects, like it's not, it's somehow misrepresenting our God-given responsibility and rights. Why do you think that is?
I am not sure that I can comment on why this is in a Canadian context, unless the US has just been that influential, which maybe it has been. But in a US context, we have this really bizarre dynamic between our two parties in a two-party system, where there's been a historic link between the Republican Party and conservative evangelicals for a lot of complicated reasons that are explained in Kristen Kobes-Dumay's book, Jesus and John Wayne, among other places. And the Republican Party prizes itself on fewer government regulations and freedom of enterprise, and, a capitalism, like you go out and, earn your million. Whereas the Democratic Party is the one that's associated with environmental concern and needing more strict government regulations to care for the environment. And it's so bizarre to me, because I've grown up in this world in which Christians were suspicious of anyone who seemed like they were trying to save the planet. When in fact, what the Bible teaches is that this is the core of our human responsibility on earth, is to care for. So this has baffled me, over the past 10, 20 years, as I've kind of awakened to this really strange disconnect between Christian theology and creation care, where these should be integrally related. But we're so polarized in our thinking in the US between these two parties, and there's been such a strong attachment of conservatives to the Republican Party. One big reason is that the Republican Party is pro-life, fighting for the unborn, and so that becomes the thing that sort of drowns out all the other issues. So you said Christians have not traditionally cared very much for the environment or not done much about it. There is an exception to that, and that is progressive Christians, who tend to be more democratic or vote more democratic in the US, do tend to care a lot about creation. Or you'll have someone in a conservative space who is, in a Republican majority context, who cares about the earth, but that's like in a completely different category in their brain than theology. Like, they recycle because recycling is the right thing to do, but they're not thinking about recycling Christianly. They're thinking about it just because that's what, that's our sort of citizen responsibility. So there's a lot of weird disconnects, and I don't know where your listeners will be on the spectrum of political views, and how this will land with them. I grew up in a Republican context, and I probably didn't know any Democrats growing up. Like, I probably didn't know any Christians who were voting Democrat. If they did, they weren't letting anyone else know. And now, now that I've grown up and I have Christians more across the spectrum of political views, I can see these just sort of strange fault lines between the positions. If you're just going to leave politics completely out of it and you're going to read Genesis, you come away with a very strong clarion call for humans to care for this earth.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to help Christians recover that and see that it's a gospel issue. People separate it. I think you said that it's kind of separated from image of God. Like, no, we need to care for people, not the planet.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the things Sandra Richter does a really good job of showing in her book is that the failure to care for the planet actually harms people. That might seem obvious, but like somehow we don't think of these things, like maybe because part of the mentality has been Jesus is coming back like any minute now, like he's just going to come. And so we don't need to worry about long-term sustainability because Jesus is coming any minute. But the fact of the matter is that wealthy communities export their messiest and most environmentally suspect projects to areas where poor people live, and in countries where poorer people live, or where people are experiencing poverty. So we export the mess. We don't see what strip mining is doing, or mountaintop removal, or the kinds of farming that we're doing that are inhumane. We don't see that. It's the communities where people are more vulnerable that they're having to live around this, the emissions or the lack of, I lost my word, habitat for animals and birds to flourish. Like they're living in communities where that habitat has been lost. We're far from it if we're wealthy. So, yeah.
And I appreciate that. I'm going to make sure we drop a link. There was a really great interview with Sandra Richter on Script, would have been a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so buy the books, but also if you're looking for just an hour kind of primer on some of the stuff, she did a great job there.
Yeah. She's done a lot of podcast interviews on this topic, and she's always worth listening to.
Yeah. But you mentioned, and I know we're running short on time, but near the end there, you mentioned how, somebody could recycle and they could, shop ethically, and they could do all these things, but they could do it without doing it in the name of Christ.
Sure.
Going back to a little bit more to maybe your first book, the idea that everything we do in some respects, especially if we do claim faith in Christ, it bears upon the name of Christ. And so as I was getting some of these questions together for you a few weeks ago, I mentioned that in the town in which I live, there's been kind of a boom recently in homelessness, partially due to inflation and also just a lot of other kind of very complicated factors. But there's a lot more people who are having a harder time finding housing. And they call, because that it obviously has a lot of negative effects, not just for the people who are homeless, but for people in neighborhoods around them. So they called a town meeting, and a friend of mine works in local shelter, and actually he runs the shelter. And so he was one of the few people who went to kind of be a panel at this town meeting where people were kind of raising their concerns. And one of the things he noticed was that the majority of people who were working towards trying to find a solution to this were not people of faith.
Yeah.
And now I throw no stones because I was not at that meeting either. So that's not really the point, because it would bounce off my computer screen if I tried to throw it. But the point is that kind of systemically, I mean, there's a lot of pushback in our circles against creation care, but there's also a tremendous amount of pushback. I'm not even going to say the 3 letters CRT. Oh, I said them, but we'll leave that one completely aside. But there's a ton of pushback about social justice issue. Like if you just if you want to look up memes about social justice warriors, there's enough of them where they make fun of it. Or anything that looks like it's about some sort of a care that's leans towards any kind of Marxism, anything that looks like it's just it can't possibly seem to be reconciled with a faith in Christ. And so this whole thing is just it causes people to not have, it seems like it's causing us to not be able even to see the name of Christ to be brought into these kinds of conversations, because the well has been so deeply poisoned. And so I'm hoping that you have just one silver bullet answer to fix all of this for us, Carmen. Crap.
Wow.
Possible. I thought this would just roll off your tongue.
I don't think I can fix this, Marc. Wow. But I think you're right that Christians are not, it used to be that Christians were leading the way on social issues. And there's been this strange divide where those things, dealing with people experiencing homelessness, figuring out affordable housing, addressing the drug crisis or policing problems like disproportionate incarceration of people of color. These sorts of things are billed to be a distraction from the gospel. It's a very strange thing to me. And part of what I'm trying to do in my Image of God book is bring these conversations back together. And so that we can see that as we lean into our human identity as God's image, and as we seek to bear his name well in the world, that we're looking at all of those implications, and we're thinking about what are the implications for race and gender and ability, creation care, all of those areas. I think Christians need to be showing up at these meetings, participating. And I like you, I can't throw stones because I'm not at these meetings myself, right? I'm still new in Southern California, still trying to get the lay of the land. Life is full. When you're a Christian and you're involved in church, life feels full. There's already a lot of events going on. So to get involved in civic events as well, or civic responsibilities, may seem heavy. So I don't know if churches could start to redirect some of our energy to be more active in the community. I heard a few months ago about a church that was trying to address this problem of not enough affordable housing during the pandemic. And here's how they addressed it. They opened up their parking lot and advertised that people could come park, people who were living in their vehicle could come park overnight in the parking lot. They paid somebody to be a guard, like a night watchman, to like make sure that nobody was being harmed, so that they could sleep in peace all night in their car. And then they opened up the church in the morning for people to come in and use the bathroom and take a shower. So they had showers inside their church. So instead of trying to shoo people away and say, not on our property, they said, no, come here and we'll provide security for you. That is putting shoe leather to the gospel. Instead of trying to export the problem somewhere else, it's saying, okay, let's see how we can address this. It's not a long-term solution, right? We don't want lots of people living in their cars, but we would, for someone who's temporarily having to live in their car, let's give them a safe place to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I had an opportunity to speak a month ago or so with somebody else who's been working in a lot of social justice fields for a long time, kind of internationally. And one of the things that she brought out was the idea that a lot of times people just look at it as a cup of cold water. Here's a cup of cold water. And they're seeing that it's not, as you mentioned earlier, it's not a gospel issue because it's not necessarily saving this person's soul. And it's not even really representing the name of Christ in a way that's kind of like explicit. So then they're like, well, how? So then the key could be then is to making sure, and sometimes this has been abused and misused, but is to make sure that the cup of cold water is being given in the name of Jesus, right? Like that's what he, anyone who does that in my name, right? Now, whether that means that you wear a ball cap at the time or make sure there's a track attached to the cup of water, I know that there's ways of making sure that something is done in his name without his name even necessarily being spoken.
Well, if it's happening on church property, that would be one way.
That is a great way, right? Yeah.
Right.
But even showing up to these town meetings and giving of your time, not watching a baseball game or Stranger Things season 4 and saying tonight I'm going to go to this thing. I'm going to give a couple hours of my time. I'm going to give some of my money. I might not be able to preach the gospel while I'm there, but I believe that this is a way that I can represent God. Represent even more explicitly Jesus Christ in this place, in this time, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned CRT, so I'm just going to dive in and say one more thing.
We just run out of time. Thank you so much, Carmen, for just really appreciate it.
I think it's just baffling to me. Just for the record, I haven't studied CRT. I'm not a racism scholar, but I think it's baffling that the same people who are really strong on seeing original sin and saying that humans are depraved and fallen and in need of redemption, has such a hard time seeing that systems that are started by those people and institutions built by those people could also be depraved. That could that we might even have structures in our society that in which sin is baked into how it works, that there's advantages given to some people and disadvantages for others based on the color of their skin or their gender or their ability. It's bizarre to me how much resistance there is in the church to the whole idea of there being systemic injustice. And so, you were talking about a cup of cold water. And I think, yes, let's give a cup of cold water, but how about we also dig a well while we're at it so that the water will continue to be available? And this is what I see happening in Genesis 1 and 2, that God is commissioning humans to actually make the world a better place, to build systems that make space for human flourishing. And so I think that's what we can lean into more, how can we leave this planet better than we found it? Each of us is given 80 years to do so. How can we do that in a way that honors God and that truly affirms the dignity of every other human being, whether or not they're a follower of Jesus? They are a person with full dignity given to them by God.
Yeah, there's some orthodox understandings of kind of Genesis 1 and 2 in particular, where the idea wasn't simply for these two people to sit there and to enjoy Eden, but was for them to help build Eden a couple feet out, and then a couple more feet out.
The expanding the boundaries of sacred space until the whole world is this place of flourishing.
Yeah. And so we, as you mentioned earlier, we kind of have an apocalyptic view of the end. And I don't necessarily mean that there's going to be a movie with a fireball that's going to come in, but just that something's going to radically come in and kind of flick the switch at the end. And to be honest with you, I don't know enough about end times to say whether or not that's really what will happen. I know that there have been other understandings over Christian history, though, that have said that maybe we don't have to wait for things to burn down before they can be reset. Maybe we can have a little bit more Eden here today than we had yesterday. Not because of human working or whatever, but because of the Holy Spirit working through us to affect change. But, yeah. Wow. Listen, now we really are genuinely up front. Thank you very much for giving me some significant clickbait that I can drop in at the end. That's great. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This has been a fun conversation.
So everyone's going to check out your book when it comes out. I don't imagine you have a publication date.
I don't have the date precisely, but it'll be spring 23. So
spring 20. Pre-order Being God's Image by Carmen Joy Imes. We're not really sure.
The joy will be on there. All the
She's
joy.
got the joy. All right.